Today's episode is presented by Filer Credit Union with Michigan locations in Manistee, Ludington, Bear Lake, and East Lake, and the Mason County Historical Society, which operates historic White Pine Village, the Port of Ludington Maritime Museum, and the Rose Hawley Archives in downtown Ludington, Michigan.
A freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm last night, and so far, no survivors have been found. The freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was transporting iron ore when it ran into high winds and 25-foot waves. Rebecca Bell has the story.
Well, Todd and I worked together at the Daily News, for me, full-time for 3 years. Probably summers before that, I would come up when I was at Ohio University in the journalism school. Todd was at Michigan State, and then we worked full-time together for 3 years. And we've, covered storms and fires and all kinds of different things together over the years, but it was a very unusual day. I just remember I was just saying, I woke up maybe 6 o'clock in the morning, and I thought somebody's breaking into the apartment. I was living at Washington and Ludington Avenue in the Peller Apartments, and I looked out the window, and the traffic light there at Washington and Ludington Avenue was like this. And the wind, I don't think I've ever heard the wind blowing as hard as it was. And I got in my car and headed down Ludington Avenue, and I usually met the editor, Paul Peterson, and others at Box Bakery. Mm-hmm. And instead of going there, I went straight down Ludington Avenue, and I saw a gentleman get out of his car in front of the old Hamlin, and the door blew off the car and started tumbling down the street. And it was ferocious. And as it got lighter, because we were in November, right? I thought, I wonder what it's like out at Epworth, where my family has a cottage. So I went out to Epworth and started to walk down the South Beach, and there's an open area between some cottages, and I started to run. As I started to run, a wave hit the seawall and arced over the sidewalk, the South Beach sidewalk, which is probably a good 50 to 100 yards away from the lake. I got down by the South Beach, where there are maybe a dozen cottages, and I braced myself in a cottage called Sail Inn and just started shooting pictures. And the one got on the front page of the Daily News that day of the waves basically going over the tops of cottages, which is probably 20, 25 feet. And I'd never seen anything like it. I mean, it was amazing. I think the wind, in Paul's story, it talked, there were gusts up to 100 miles an hour. I believe that. And I know Todd had gone down to the beach, and maybe you pick it up from there.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting for me was that, as Van said, it was just a god-awful morning. And part of the morning, I was over at Chase, Michigan, about 60 miles to the east on US 10, because there was this terrible PBB contamination of animal feed. And a farmer over there whose herd was badly damaged and not producing the proper amount of milk for a long time, and there was illnesses in his family and in the area. Well, they weren't getting enough response from the government, enough help, they felt. So this farmer and his neighbors, they dug a huge trench, and they put his 108 Herefords in the trench, and then they took their deer rifles and shot them all, because the cows were contaminated, and they were not going to expose people to those cows, even though they could have shot them or killed them or taken them over to the slaughterhouse, and they would have been meat on people's table the next day. So it was a huge, and it became a national story. So I'm thinking, wow, this was, did a good job of covering this. Now I'm heading back to Ludington, and I come into downtown Ludington, and from the middle of downtown Ludington, I could already see the waves out of Michigan. And the rain had stopped, but I was still soaking wet from being out in this weather over the chase. I'm already told, instead of turning right on raft for the daily news, I went straight down to the beach, the middle of the and this image is what I ended up getting. I could hardly, as my hand was saying, the car blows up in his car, and I could hardly stand up. And we had our Nikons, but we didn't have the best equipment in the world compared to today. But even so, it was fairly easy for the Northwest Marines, I think. Pretty easy to get some spectacular imagery. And that image still stands as my favorite, although tragic, storm picture. I've studied this storm a lot, and I drove Coast Guard boats for 33 years, including right here. This was my home away from home, this building, which used to be the Coast Guard Station in Ludington. And that was the roughest by far that I've ever seen Lake Michigan. And I have driven self-righting Coast Guard 44-foot motor light boat right off of Ludington in 22-foot waves. These waves were 30, 35 feet. And in that image that I showed, the waves in the foreground of that picture, those aren't waves out on Lake Michigan. Those are the waves in the harbor. Those are the waves coming into Ludington Alley. The pier wasn't even visible. There was such a bathtub effect, a Seiche effect, a medio tsunami effect, whatever you want to call it, that you didn't see the breakwall at all. So it was the one day that I've seen that if they had said you guys got to go out in that 44-foot motor light boat and save some other ship or a car ferry that's out there and disabled. I would have said, well, we'll try. But I would have estimated we'd have rolled 3-4 times just trying to get out of the pier heads. So it was an awful day. And studying that storm in later years, unfortunately, the Fitzgerald, the Arthur Anderson, the other ships caught in that storm, they didn't have the kind of computerized weather forecasting and immediate information that we have today. So, they were caught out there. And in studying in recent years, meteorologists using data, plugging it all into computer, found out that the 3 storm fronts that came together, the epicenter of where they all collided, like the perfect storm out on the East Coast, this was the perfect Great Lakes storm, and the epicenter was Whitefish Bay, where the ship's in. Now, segue over to Ludington, Michigan. No, it wasn't as rough here, but had the car ferry been out there that day, well, they'd have had quite a time trying to get in. Would they have ended up on the beach like they did in the Armistice Day storm with ships a sunk? Yes, I think that's very likely. And it was the second lowest barometer reading in the recorded history of Ludington. The only lower reading was the Armistice Day storm, which is on display in this room in 1940.
I remember the Spartan had come in and was in the harbor and couldn't dock. And it was pointed into the wind. Remember, it was there for like 15 hours. And I think it got in before it really got bad, but it couldn't make the dock.
Yeah, I think I saw that twice in all my years at the Daily News, where the car ferry came in. And at that time, the channel here in front of the Coast Guard Station was only half as wide. So these masters, they were masters, and they threaded that needle, and they came in at high speed, and they'd make that power, like a power slide U-turn, like a dirt track racer, and they have to do that early and anticipate. And then they drove their ship right up into the winds where now would be crosswinds. Crosswinds didn't exist, you know.
Yeah.
There was sand, and they just they purposely grounded the bows of their boats and kept the power on a little bit forward and sat there until the storm was over or subsided enough it was safe to dock.
Yeah, I remember being down where the Coast Guard Station was, and it was icy, and I remember parking my car, and this is after I'd taken my pictures, and I knew Todd was down, photographing, the lighthouse and what was going on there, but you could literally lean into the wind.
Yeah.
And I had a Volkswagen at the time, and it was starting to move a little bit on the ice. And then also I remember going down Dowling Street at Dowling and Washington Avenue where Gunberg's was, and the bricks were coming off the building. It was blowing so hard. And again, I don't think I'd ever seen anything that compared to that. I mean, we've seen 70-mile-an-hour winds. This summer we had that big storm, but I agree with Todd. Nothing like that. I'm not sure we'd ever see anything like that again.
Yeah. And they were sustained winds. So sometimes we get these flash storms, especially in the summer, you get these huge storms and they come in, and if you can survive for 15 minutes, you're probably going to be all right.
Exactly.
They're moving 30, 40 miles an hour. But this storm just kept sustaining. When you get 50+ mile-an-hour winds for hours and hours, there's a lot of bad things happen, including in nautical terms, what you call fetch. So the further that the waves travel as they're getting bigger, then the bigger they get. So the farther you are away from the start, and that storm wasn't just here. That storm was there. It was sustained there for a long time. So all that fetch just continues to push those waves to this side of the lake, which is the prevailing winds in most storms. They're coming out of the northwest, the west, or the southwest, and that water is being driven over here. So the power of nature is pretty incredible. And as photographers, we had no idea. I mean, we in outdoor photography, which my son and I and our manager Rachel do, we say bad is good in outdoor photography. But nevertheless, we still don't want, and we feel terrible when people get hurt or killed because of the storm.
Sure.
And so, as you were saying, we didn't know, and I think Rob Alway, who we were just talking with, we didn't, of course, know at the time we were making these images that people were going to die a bit later in the evening on Whitefish Bay.
Todd, what was the theory on that? I mean, I've read all kinds of different things that the Edmund Fitzgerald got caught in a trough and split in the middle. I mean, what? Well, based on your history,
I've just been seeing some more stuff on that recently, and there's multiple theories. That it is known and documented in conversation between the Arthur Anderson, which was a ship that was a little further out in Whitefish Bay, and they were keeping an eye on each other, and the captains were talking back and forth until the Fitzgerald lost all communications because the captain had already told the captain of the Anderson that the radar, they'd lost the radar, had been basically ripped off the ship, already by waves, and but they still had some radio communication with the Anderson, and maybe that was even just low power. It could have been portable radio because they were miles apart, but the signal might get through. But the Anderson, they and the Fitzgerald, the captain of the Fitzgerald told them that we've lost or leaking water in hatch covers. I think that's hatch covers gone, but they have water. They're taking, but some of the last words were, "We're holding our own." We're still holding our own. So one of the theories is they just literally maybe got enough water and enough that they literally dove down in Another one is because these freighters are so long, was the Fitzgerald 700 and some feet, I think, that it gets on the front and the bow and the stern get on the tops of waves, and then there's nothing. The waves are so big, there's nothing beneath supporting the middle of the ship, and it just breaks. And another theory is that, or in combination, that they shoaled out, that they literally, because they were in a lot closer to shore than the Anderson, that possibly they hit bottom. Also, when you get in shoal water, most of the time when you start getting into shoal water in any sort of stormy weather, it tends to be a lot rougher, because the waves are breaking there, and waves are going to break a lot farther from shore if the storm is bigger, because the reason waves break near shore is that the waves moving along the bottom of the wave starts hitting the bottom, and it slows down. And then the top of the wave still has its energy and keeps going, and it literally trips. It falls over the bottom. Now, as waves get 30-some feet or wherever they were,
right.
50 feet with some rogue wave on the Whitefish Bay there, the distance from shore that the wave can hit bottom and trip becomes a lot more further from shore.
Sure.
So multiple reasons, but the bottom line is that the Great Lakes are still a very, very powerful, dangerous place, and even with our modern ships, bad things can happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people don't, and particularly people that just come up here in the summertime, have no clue at how rough Lake Michigan can get. It can get as ferocious as the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, in some cases, I mean, maybe not as frequently, but that's why we have a revetment at Epworth now that is about 6 feet tall, because the water came up, but even this summer it protected us, even though the lake level is down because of the velocity of that wind we had this summer. So
what you're saying there, sometimes people can poo-poo the Great Lakes. I'm an ocean sailor. I've been in real storms. Well, I've sailed on the ocean on the edge of a hurricane in the Coast Guard on a 311-foot ship, and there was some huge waves, and I've also driven Coast Guard motor lifeboats out here on Lake Michigan in huge waves, and one of the differences is that the waves are so much closer together on the Great Lakes, and so you're just constantly adjusting and fighting to be able to survive the next wave. Whereas when you're out on the ocean, the Coast Guard National Motor Lifeboat School, they teach us what's called wave avoidance. You're seeing a line of waves the breaking line coming at you. You're approaching it, and you see a low spot, and so you kind of turn sideways. You drive over toward the low spot, and then you turn up into the wave so that you're squaring up into it, and then you power up at with the right feel, and over you go. But while you're going over that, you're looking out at the next line, and then you adjust and you go over there. Well, one year at the National Motor Lifeboat School, they usually, most of the time when you came here, inspectors from the school, there was a national team would come, and they would get just mild to moderate Lake Michigan weather. But this one particular inspection, they came, we got just a fresh breeze, snotty day, and let's just say the waves were 10 to 12 with an occasional bigger. And that's not huge. The boat's rated for 30-foot seas, 20-foot breaking surf. But what we were able to show those inspectors, and what they were quite kind of impressed with, was that how quickly the next set of waves came at you. In other words, when it's really rough, you don't have a lot of time to drive over sideways and pick the low spot in the next big wave coming at you. In fact, sometimes you might actually find yourself, you got this wall of waves coming at you, and so you decide there's no need to make a big adjustment. And then especially when the waves are running, you're running with the waves. You're down in a trough. You come up on a wave and say, "Oh, well, we can ride the back of that one," and then you look back and there's one coming behind you that's running a lot bigger, and sometimes it's almost too late to turn the boat into it, because that would be sometimes a good course of action. So anyway, the waves are different on Lake Michigan, and they affect ships differently. That's the bottom line, and it's dangerous in its own way. Mm-hmm.
Come to the area, but I would say things look pretty bad. Like you may have read about the things like the morale did a few years back. I'm wondering because the mission up here, we hit off in the last known position that we had at only 14 miles west of Copper Mine Point. And I know we had been told, we just talked to him, about after 7, and he said everything was fine, and the question was, he returned and never saw anything about it. But we saw no, it had been wrinkly with light on flashing, and the visibility was good. I took a go right at you, and you are definitely sure that you was ahead of you, is that correct? By that, sure, yes, and the wind was west-northwest out there, steady 55 through gusting to 70. Took a go, Roger. Keep me posted on your progress, and we'll be back in touch with you. Over. Missing Edmund Fitzgerald in your area. Request you search an area 15 miles due west, Copper Mine Point, Ontario, and 15 miles north of Cliff Point. Okay, that was the last known position of the Edmund Fitzgerald at approximately 7:10 local time tonight.
So what was the feeling after you found out the Fitzgerald went down? Was that obviously it kind of changed the whole story at that point?
Sure. I think, look, I think there was, sadness and just, I think, shock more than anything else. And I kind of remember we talked about, just as Todd mentioned earlier, can you imagine if the car ferry had gotten caught up into that, it got into the harbor before it really got bad. But it sat there for 12, 15 hours. Yeah. Before it could dock, and so I think that, and obviously it became a national story. But I think one of the things we realized that the focus was on Lake Superior, but that storm, as Todd said, affected all the Great Lakes. Yeah. At that point. It was really a perfect storm.
Yeah, and I think one of the things when you ask about how we felt. Of course, I would say one of the things I'm proud of with this guy is that as hard as we ran, as much as we chased all the bad news, that was the news business even more than today, probably. Hard news was it. And we ran hard, but we were also very empathetic, and we would help the rescuers, and we became good friends with the police and the sheriff's officers, and great, and they gained respect for us, and we looked out for each other,
That's true.
And sometimes they stopped the blue bug for going 90 miles an hour to a scene, but then they said, "Oh, okay, we understand."
Sure.
But I think one of the things that really occurs to me too is with my Coast Guard connection, I was already driving Coast Guard motor lifeboats in the Coast Guard Reserve at that time. So I could really feel the sense of somebody actually losing their life in the storm out there, because it could, came close to home in that respect. But the other thing that really struck me, refer to the paper here, is this is the Ludington Daily News that next day. And as we did with so many big news events, we all put our heart and soul into it. And that was led, in this particular case, Russ Miller, the chief photographer, he was not involved where many times it would be his photography and we the support or whatever. But the other thing that really struck me is the editor of the newspaper, Paul Peterson. He was a huge history buff, but he was also the son of a sailor. So he really had a strong feeling for car ferries and the ships and that. And Paul, Vance and I took pictures, but Paul wrote the local, Paul S. Peterson, managing editor, he wrote the story that day. And he had with his knowledge and background, it's a really excellent story.
Yeah, it was a real good historical perspective, juxtaposed to what was going on, that day with the storm.
And as the years went on, and we would recount the storm or recount the history of the car ferries, do a special edition or whatever, it was Paul Peterson who led the way on the importance of those topics.
Absolutely.
And